Imagine having to update a navigation button across 30 different scenes in your interactive story app. Changing each one by hand would be slow and frustrating. That's where prefabs come in. In this video, I'll show you how to use prefabs in Unity to speed up your development and save tons of time. In the last video, we set up page navigation with just a few lines of code. If you haven't seen it yet, I've linked it at the top and in the description. It will give you some context before diving into prefabs. Here's the problem. In that approach, every scene needed its own setup. We had to create an empty game object, attach the navigation script, and wire up the home, next, and previous buttons over and over again. It worked, but it's not efficient for big projects. Prefabs fix this. Think of a prefab as a master copy of a game object. Once you set it up, you can reuse it everywhere, and if you ever make a change, it automatically updates across all scenes. In the next few minutes, I'll show you exactly how to do that. Now, let's dive into the process. The first thing that I have done is remove all the page controller game objects holding our navigation script from all the 4 scenes. I have left the buttons on page 1, but without the click implementation, as we'll use them for the prefab setup. Notice that I have this prefab subfolder here that I already created. Now, it's not a requirement, but it's highly recommended for organizing your prefab assets. I have a few prefabs in here which are in use for the finalized Hidden Quest demo app. To create a prefab, you simply drag the object from the hierarchy into your assets folder or any subfolder within it. First, I'm going to unhide this previous button. I initially hid it because to navigate from page 1 to the menu scene, you'll have to use the home button. For our first prefab, let's start with the next button. I'll simply click on it and drag it into this prefabs folder. Now, watch how the color changes to blue in the hierarchy. That's it. The prefab retains the name of the initial object and also the position at which it was created. For the home button, select it in the hierarchy and drag it into the prefab subfolder. It too changes to a blue color in the hierarchy. Lastly, select and drag the previous button from the hierarchy into the prefabs folder. Notice that all 3 objects remain in the hierarchy, although in blue colors. They also exist in the prefabs subfolder. The ones in the hierarchy are simply copies of the ones in the prefabs subfolder. To distinguish between the two, we can refer to the prefabs in the subfolder as master copies and the ones in the hierarchies as instances of those master copies. Now that we have these copies, we can reuse them across all the other pages by simply dragging them from our prefab subfolder onto the hierarchy. But that's not really showing us the power of prefabs at the moment. What we can also do is to look at another common step or action in our navigation setup. In this case, we still have to attach a controller to each button and set up the click event. We could integrate this into our prefabs as follows. To edit our prefab, we'll double click on it. So starting with the next button, double click to enter into its isolation mode for editing. Next, I'll create an empty game object here and call it nav controller. I can now attach the Hidden Quest controller script component that contains the 10 lines of code required for navigation. So drag it into the inspector to attach. I can then wire up this button for the click event. To do that, under the button component in the inspector, click the plus icon here. Drag the nav controller in here and then select the script and then the function for navigation, which is called go to scene. I'm going to leave empty the field where we enter the scene to navigate to. This is because the name depends on the scene where we place this button. In other words, when on page 1, the field should hold the name of scene 2. And when placed on scene 2, it should hold the name for scene 3. And on, but we'll get to that later. Now let's edit the home button prefab. I'll create an empty game object called nav controller. The name doesn't really matter, so feel free to call it anything you want. I'll attach that Hidden Quest controller script by dragging it into the inspector as its component. Next, select the button. Click the plus icon there in the inspector's button component and drag the nav controller game object in there. Select the script name from the drop-down and then select that go to scene function. For the home button, regardless of where it's placed, we always want to navigate to the menu scene when clicked, so we can simply enter its name in the field. Repeat the process for the previous button Prefab. Similar to the next button, I'll leave this field empty because we are going to be navigating to different scenes depending on which scene it's placed on. Now, this might seem like a long process, but it's a one-off. Once you do this initial setup, it becomes easier and more efficient to manage different changes to these buttons. With that done, we can click here to exit the Prefab edit mode and into our page 1. The prefabs in the hierarchy are in use, but we can remove them all. However, because we have created these prefabs, which are like master copies, we can reuse them by dragging them into the hierarchy. So first, I'll drag in the home button. In the scene, it's automatically positioned at the exact spot we initially created the home button prefab. Notwithstanding, you could still reposition this instance in the scene without affecting the master copy. Next, I'll drag the next button prefab into the hierarchy. As with the home button, it's auto-positioned exactly where we created it from. For page 1, I'll leave the previous button because we have the home button to navigate back to the menu scene. However, I still need to type in the name of the scene I want to navigate to when I click on the next button. Remember that we left it empty in the prefab setup for obvious reasons. In this case, when we click on the next button, we want to navigate to page 2. That's it. Now on to page 2. Presently, you can see page 2 has none of the navigation buttons. Again, I'll go back to my hierarchy, open up my canvas, then the background panel where I want to drag in my button. In my prefabs folder, I'll drag the home, next, and previous buttons under the UI panel. I can also reposition any of them for this page. Lastly, I'll enter in the scene names where I want the next and previous buttons to navigate to when clicked. On page 3 and 4, we'll repeat the process. Drag into the hierarchy from the prefabs folder, reposition if we like, and enter in the scene names to navigate to for the next and previous buttons. We'll skip the next button for page 4 as it's the last page. Make sure to save each scene when you're done. To test, we'll go back and run it. We can navigate to the menu scene by clicking on the home button. We go back in, let's click the next button, and we can go back to the previous scene using the previous button. So we can navigate all the way back and forth with ease. It still works as expected. So that's it. That's how easy it is to work with prefabs. Now, if I need to make any edits to any of these prefabs, I can just double click on it and make the edit, and it will be reflected in its instances or copies. Let's try that out. So let's say I want to change the text on the previous button to a shortened text, prev. What I simply need to do is go into the previous button prefab edit mode by double clicking on it. Select the text object of the button in the hierarchy and change its text from previous to prev. That's it. Now, if I leave the edit mode, you can see the change reflected across all the previous buttons in each scene. That's it. I don't have to change anything else or change them one by one. This is how useful prefabs can be, especially when you consider repetitive assets or processes across multiple scenes. There's so much more you can do with prefabs in Unity, but I hope this gives you a solid foundation to start using them in your own projects. If you found this useful, give the video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.